wanted to start by asking you about vaping and e-cigarettes. It's a term that probably we've started to hear a lot more about in the last 5 or 6 years, and certainly in the last year. Can you tell me what is this that people are doing?
You're absolutely right that this is a very important growing phenomenon, and an example of that is that the Oxford English Dictionary, they choose a new word of the year each year, and a couple years ago it was vape. So that's just a justification that I think it is a good thing for people to know about. That being said, a lot of parents don't know what vaping is. What it is the use of an electronic cigarette. Electronic cigarettes, they still have a liquid in them that does contain nicotine, and the aerosol, what comes out of it, does contain a lot of the chemicals that are in cigarettes, but generally in smaller amounts.
There are certain ages to buy cigarettes. Are these not regulated as strictly as nicotine is right now?
Right now, the regulation is spotty. So it is certainly not terrible in the sense that there are limitations on where you can buy these things and what age you have to be. However, the regulations are definitely not strong enough. And so the Food and Drug Administration is working on trying to figure out the right balance in terms of regulation.
But still not difficult for teens to get a hold of these.
Correct. That's a really good point to emphasize. In fact, it's quite easy to get them, not just in the local environment, but for example, on the internet, it's very easy to get as much apparatus, as much liquid nicotine as you'd like.
Your most recent research, can you give me an overview of what you were looking at, how many kids you studied, and where you got the information?
The study that we published in the American Journal of Medicine recently involved us looking at almost 2,000 young people ages 18 to 30. And what we did was we looked at them over an 18-month period. And we specifically wanted to focus on the people who said that they were never interested in smoking cigarettes. We use items to find out, are they even potentially interested? And these were people that we would consider completely non-susceptible. In general, this group of people over 18 months, maybe 5, maybe 10% of them will end up trying a cigarette. But of the people who were experimenting with vaping at the time, it turned out that almost 50% of them tried a cigarette by the end of the study period. And this is very concerning because we're talking about a big population of people who normally would probably not move on to start smoking cigarettes. But because they had been exposed to nicotine and because they had potentially learned the behaviors involved with smoking, which are very similar to the behaviors of smoking an e-cigarette, they did go on and transition to cigarette smoking.
What does this suggest?
Well, it suggests that we need to be very cautious. Right now, there are a lot of young people out there who really draw a big distinction and say, well, this must be safe. I would never smoke a regular cigarette because I know that that's really bad for you. But what they don't realize is that they are taking in a lot of the same chemicals. In addition, they don't realize that this is almost a perfect starter cigarette in many ways. These apparatus are flavored. They are very easy to use. And so they're the type of thing that can help a young person get used to the side effects of nicotine, get used to the behaviors involving cigarette smoking. And so it makes sense that it makes them more likely to transition later on.
So it's a gateway for some?
I would say that it is a gateway for some. Maybe not all. Certainly some people will experiment with this and say, nah, I don't want to go and continue to use this. I don't want to continue to use regular cigarettes. But as we saw from our study, almost 50% of people were moving on. Now, some of those people may have experimented with cigarettes anyway, but in our study, of the non-susceptible people who had not used e-cigarettes, it was only about 10% that moved on. So 48% versus 10% is a big difference.
Does this build on studies you had done earlier on a younger set of kids, and can you speak to that a little bit?
We previously looked at slightly younger individuals starting in the 16-year-old age range, and we found consistent results there. And that study we published in JAMA Pediatrics, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association's journal that focuses on pediatric health. And that also showed that young people who initially were completely non-susceptible were much more likely, if they had experimented with e-cigarettes, to then move on to cigarette smoking.
I've also heard a lot of health reports that e-cigarettes were a way for people who were hooked on nicotine and smoking to wean themselves off of cigarettes. Is that the case, or is that not the case?
Well, there certainly has been a lot of excitement around that and this is a lot of the reason why people have said, hey, this might be a great idea for Uncle Joe, our 55-year-old smoker who's tried many other ways to quit, is not able to, and this might be a really good way to at least have him exposed to less harm. And that certainly is the case for some people. However, in general, we've been disappointed with the numbers. For example, the one study that's been done that really was a randomized trial that randomized some people to using e-cigarettes and some people to using the patch, the success with e-cigarettes was no better statistically than that of the patch. But the patch is not mango flavored and doesn't entice young people to use nicotine and be exposed to nicotine at a young age. So overall, in a larger public health sense, even though there are some people that would be benefiting from e-cigarettes and some people that would be harmed, overall, a lot of the research is suggesting that the overall harm balance is leading toward the negative side.
What do parents really need to know about what's out there and what their teens may be looking at?
Well, I think parents need to know the language. They need to know what vaping is. They need to know what Juul is. That Juul is an example of a particular brand. They need to know these things so that they can be talking to their children. And it actually needs to be quite early, because these days, young people in middle schools are commonly vaping, just like it used to be that they would smoke cigarettes in the bathroom. Now they're vaping in the bathroom or after school. And many of them don't realize that nicotine is harmful to a developing brain even by itself. They don't realize that they're also being exposed to many of the chemicals of cigarettes, and they don't realize that they are more susceptible to cigarette smoking later on. So parents, and I think other societal organizations as well, I think should start to educate. And it needs to be quite early, maybe even starting in the 8, 9, 10-year-old age range. There have been data that the first cigarette is often at 11 to 12, and so that is a key age range to at least start this education. But then I think it's also important to emphasize that education needs to be longitudinal. You can't just say it once at age 8 and expect that 8-year-old to remember 3, 4, 5 years later when they're a completely different person, developmentally. And so I think that, that education is someplace we can start.
What do parents need to watch for? Is this a different set of things that parents are looking for?
It is, because as you've said, it is much more palatable. And this is one of the concerns that we have. It's, flavored chocolate, mango, strawberry, the kind of things that kids are used to having, in their bubble tea. And so that's one of the reasons why we are concerned. And so there won't be as many, physical signs. I think what's important is really to have a good relationship with that young person. And instead of, what the industry, the tobacco industry, would like us to do is to make it look like forbidden fruit, to make us look like the bad guys wagging our fingers at them. I think what they need to realize is that the tobacco industry owns the major e-cigarette brands. And it's the tobacco industry that realizes that this is a way of keeping their business afloat. And I think a young person, especially someone who is naturally rebellious and sensation-seeking, is going to respond to that kind of message and say, I don't want to be manipulated by those guys, rather than us just wagging our fingers at them saying, don't you dare do this, is to demonstrate that we're on their side and that we together do not want them to be manipulated by this large entity.
You had mentioned know the terms. Could you throw a couple of terms out there that parents should listen for?
Sure. Other brands are Views and Mark 10. The word vape is interesting in itself because it implies that you are taking in a vapor. And the industry specifically has been using that term, even though that is not scientifically correct, because what people are actually breathing in is an aerosol. An aerosol, which of course does not sound as sexy as vape, is a different kind of chemical composition, and it is one that is more concerning than a vapor. Vapor implies water vapor, which of course we're breathing all the time. Aerosol implies one of those aerosol cans, and we certainly wouldn't want to breathe that in, but we need to realize that that term, even vape, is a misnomer.
Is there logical next steps then for the research?
Well, I think it's important for all of us to be starting to look at younger individuals, because even this research was conducted a few years ago, and the number of younger people who have been using e-cigarettes has risen dramatically, meaning even earlier than, say, 16. And so I think understanding the transitions at that point will be very important. But additionally, I think it's really important to do policy research, because we need to understand those policy differences right now while we are debating optimal policy. Every day, thousands of young people are using these devices and are exposing themselves to nicotine, which some biochemistry scientists say is the most addictive substance that we know of. And because that is a concern, I think we need to accelerate that policy research as much as we can. In a word, e-cigarettes are more concerning than they are beneficial at this point in time. That's going to, require more time for us to understand more about the harms, more about the benefits. But as of right now, because it's kind of the Wild West out there, and because more young people are starting to use them, and because they are presenting more harm than they are benefit, in balance, they're going to be a challenge.
And what's your area of expertise?
I'm also the director of the Center for Research on Media, Technology, and Health at the University of Pittsburgh. So my area of expertise is medicine, and specifically I study the influence of new technologies on health.
You are both an MD and PhD?
Yes, my MD, I focused on family medicine. I did my residency in family medicine. And for my PhD, I did a multidisciplinary social sciences degree that dealt with psychology and sociology.